Welcome to the Pennsylvania Game Commission's live event on the 2025-26 waterfowl hunting seasons. I'm Ian Gregg, Wildlife Operations Division Chief in the Game Commission's Bureau of Wildlife Management.
And I'm Amanda Hoyt, the waterfowl biologist for the Game Commission.
And whether you're actually joining us live today on Thursday afternoon or watching the recording later on, we thank you for your interest in waterfowl hunting and conservation here in Pennsylvania. If you are watching live, you do have the opportunity to submit questions for us to answer a little bit later on in the event. But as usual, if you've watched this in past years, we'll begin by talking about a general overview of how waterfowl hunting seasons are set, as well as some topics that we know are of particular interest this year, some things that are changing in the seasons or maybe not changing that there may be interest in making some changes, and we'll cover a few of those. So you may have some questions that we even get to ahead of time, but again, feel free if you're watching live at any time to submit questions that we'll get to later. I'll begin by giving a little bit of an overview of how waterfowl seasons are set. For a lot of species that are hunted in Pennsylvania, what I'd call the resident species, so for example, deer, bear, turkey, grouse, those seasons can be set by our Board of Commissioners without any reference to what other states are doing. The management of those species is vested in the individual state agencies. Waterfowl and other migratory birds, other migratory game birds like mourning doves and American woodcock are different because they're ultimately under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is an international treaty between the United States, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and Russia that vests the management authority for those species in the respective federal governments. So for the United States, that means the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So ultimately, our waterfowl hunting seasons, whether it's in Pennsylvania or any other state, are set under the authority of the Fish and Wildlife Service. That doesn't mean that the states don't have an opportunity for input into that process. We do a lot of cooperative monitoring and management activities. And the Flyway Council process, there's 4 administrative units across the country, and including Canada as well, that are based on migratory patterns in general, and that are used for the states to get together, discuss issues, and make recommendations to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Pennsylvania is in the Atlantic Flyway, the easternmost of those 4 flyways. And a couple times a year, the Flyway biologists and administrators get together, discuss various issues, and make recommendations to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on various matters related to hunting seasons and other aspects of migratory bird management. The Fish and Wildlife Service sometimes accepts those recommendations and approves them. Other times they don't, but that is the opportunity for states to have input into the process. How that works then on the back end, the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't tell Pennsylvania these are the exact dates that you have to have your seasons in, but what they do is set general frameworks, usually at the flyway level, and those kind of give the outer limits that we have to work within. So for example, they may say the number of hunting days that's available for a particular species, the earliest opening date that's allowed for a season, the latest closing date that's allowed, the daily bag limit, how many segments and splits you can have in the different seasons. And so within those outer parameters, then we have some opportunity to take hunter input and look at biological data that's specific to Pennsylvania, and then make season selections within those frameworks. And at this point, Amanda will talk a little bit more about that state level selection process within the federal frameworks.
Yeah, so at this point, we take a break from kind of the federal side of things, and it's pushed back to the state responsibility to select seasons within those frameworks. We can choose bag limits and splits and dates that can only be more conservative, never more liberal than what is defined in those published frameworks. Those dates are based on bird abundance within the state, maximizing hunter opportunity, and hunter preference within each zone in that order. We compile public comments from our 6 regional directors, and then our season selection letter is signed by the executive office. And then those dates are finalized through a letter to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service.
So it is a pretty complicated process, but tends to work pretty well for the most part, I think, every year going through the process. We also use a lot of data from some of our historic hunter surveys that we've done, we definitely appreciate the comments that certainly will come in on this event, as well as at the Waterfowl Open House, which is at Middle Creek this Saturday, as well as the waterfowl comments at pa.gov email. That's sort of the official place to submit your comments to make sure they make it onto the record. But obviously not everyone has the time and interest to send comments in every year, so we also appreciate that we've done some surveys of thousands of our waterfowl hunters in the past to get their opinions, which may or may not always line up with the comments that we get. So it's important to have that broad picture as well. So we talked about the frameworks. There are most years some changes to those. There's not a whole lot of changes to the federal frameworks for Pennsylvania, but there are two that we'll mention. The first of those is probably the bigger deal, and that's in relation to Atlantic population Canada geese, which Amanda will talk about.
So the frameworks for this year have led us to reduce our season dates. So we're only having a 30-day season, which is what we had last year, but our bag limit is going to be 1 bird per day. And that's only in our AP zone, which is in the southeast part of the state. So our resident population of geese make up the majority of geese in southeast PA, but we do have this migrant Atlantic population, goose population, and they're a significant component. And because they have to migrate, they're smaller bodied, and they're nesting and breeding in these areas where seasons and weather and temperature can be a lot more unpredictable and kind of volatile. That can really affect year-to-year population estimates for that population. So they can't, for those reasons, they can't sustain the same level of harvest as our larger resident population geese. So we need to base our season regulations on the status and population levels of that more susceptible Atlantic population of geese. So we've been seeing a decline from the breeding population survey over the past few years. That's from flyover transects in the breeding population in northern Quebec. So we know that we're looking at AP birds, that's where they're breeding, and that's how their population is defined. But the most recent breeding pair estimate was 88,890 pairs, which is actually the second lowest estimate that we've seen since the 90s, and that was just before we had a complete season closure. So out of an abundance of caution, the Atlantic Flyaway Council suggested a restrictive season package, which is the 30 days and the 1 bird daily bag limit. That was accepted and written into the federal frameworks. So all states, not just Pennsylvania, whoever has an AP zone, they have to also follow the 30 days, 1 bird daily bag limit for 2025-26. We also have the AP telemetry project, which we've kind of touched on for a couple years now. We're starting to wrap up field work. We actually have deployed over 500 GPS collars on AP Canada geese, both on the wintering and breeding grounds since 2022. And that project is going to help managers fine-tune those boundaries for the AP zones within all of these states. And then we're going to try and see if we can reduce, sorry, you scrolled there and it messed me up. We're going to try to limit harvest on AP without unnecessarily limiting RP opportunity in times and areas, because we don't want to limit opportunity somewhere where maybe there actually aren't any AP population geese flying through there.
The second major framework change for this year relates to the species that you see here over my right shoulder, northern pintail. And I say major change, I recognize if you're an experienced waterfowl hunter in Pennsylvania, it's pretty unusual to see any pintails at all, let alone be able to harvest a full bag limit. So this is a bigger deal for the western flyways, particularly California is a big harvest area, the Pacific flyway for pintails. But it just, for everyone's awareness, particularly if you do hunt in some of those western flyways, I know we do have hunters that travel, or if you do happen to get into a flock of pintails in Pennsylvania, just be aware that for the 25-26 hunting season, that bag limit has increased to 3 birds. If you've been hunting in Pennsylvania for a while, you know that that daily bag limit for pintails has bounced around quite a bit between 1 and 2. That was based on a national harvest strategy that basically for all 4 flyways, there was a evaluation of each year's pintail population and then a set parameters for each year's bag limit, whether it was 1, 2, or a closed season, although that hasn't happened for a while. There's always been some interest, particularly as I mentioned in the Pacific Flyway, and would it be possible to have an additional pintail in the bag? And so that harvest strategy was revised recently. And for the Western 3 flyways, it's sort of similar to what it has been in the past, except for that addition of the option of a 3-bird daily bag limit. You look at the pintail populations, the season's either closed or a bag limit of 1, 2, or 3, and actually in all of those flyways for 25-26, there will be a 3-bird bag limit based on the pintail population. The change to the harvest strategy was for the Atlantic Flyway, which is really a minor player in pintail harvest. The Atlantic Flyway only harvests about 5% of the total pintail harvest across the country every year, and obviously Pennsylvania is only even a small fraction of that. Because of that small impact on harvest, it was possible to make pintail regulations just simpler in the Atlantic Flyway. So basically now there's only 2 options for the Atlantic Flyway. If pintail populations get so low that the season is completely closed, it's completely closed in all 4 flyways. But as long as there's an open season in the Atlantic Flyway, the bag limit's always going to be 3 birds, even when it might be fluctuating in those 3 Western flyways. So again, probably not a major issue for you in Pennsylvania, but just something to be aware of that's changed this year. So that covers the major framework changes, and now we'll shift gears a little bit into some of the common questions that we've gotten in past years and already through the Waterfowl comments email this year, just some of the typical hot topics that we get questions on. The first one of those, I'll turn over to Amanda.
Yeah, so one of the most common questions we get, or comments through our comment email, is why aren't we running our duck seasons till the end of January as it's stated in the federal frameworks? It can go out to January 31st. And we get a lot of comments mostly from the south duck zone. So research suggests that late season hunting can cause a disruption in pair bonds and have physiological effects of disturbance, and then ultimately negatively impact productivity in the subsequent breeding season. So basically, males that have already paired up will be harvested potentially at that end of season, January 31st date, and then the female won't have a pair bond at that point. She'll have to go and use energy to find another mate, and doing that takes away from her time where she should be eating a lot of really great food sources that she needs for egg laying and breeding and migration, most importantly. And there has been research showing in simulated captive populations that it can ultimately lead to less eggs per nest and less nesting attempts, which is important for production for our next hunting season. Research also shows that waterfowl are very sensitive to hunting pressure and disturbance in general, and they will very quickly change their behaviors to avoid that disturbance, which is why it might seem like birds are just showing up soon after the hunting season ends, because they don't have that pressure anymore. They're starting to fly over different places and accessing food sources that were dangerous for them to access when the hunting season was open. Additionally, the fact that frameworks allow hunting until the end of January doesn't have any biological background to that decision. That was dictated by politicians and not resource managers. Also, we have some weekly abundance data that we get through eBird, and I'll show you guys a little bit later with some graphs that I made that our current hunting seasons actually line up really well with times of the highest bird abundance for dabbling and diving ducks. A secondary issue is that moving those days late in the season, since we can only have for ducks a 60-day season, would force us to take days away from the front end of the season that are important to other hunters. Maybe they like wood duck hunting in October. Some people want to hunt over the holidays, etc. So we have to take everyone's preferences into consideration.
It's like a lot of these issues, there's a balance of those biological and social factors that we always have to take into consideration, but certainly the biology is really what has always driven us on not running so late into January. Sort of semi-related to that, we talked about South Zone being an area where we particularly get those comments with an interest in running the season later than we do. Sometimes a different angle on that is, well, what about the current structure of our duck and goose zones? Why are they the way they are, and could we make potentially some changes that would make things better for our hunters? This isn't something we go into in detail every year with these events, but this is a good time to talk about it a little bit, because for duck zones specifically, every 5 years the Fish and Wildlife Service has what they call an open season, ironically enough, since we're talking about hunting. But an open season for states to look at their zones and potentially choose different configurations. Now there are some sideboards on that of what the allowable options are. Pennsylvania, it's important to realize, actually has what's called a grandfathered arrangement. So I think it's been for about 40 years now. We have 4 duck zones, and in each one of those zones we're allowed to have 2 segments. So have a open season, a closed period, and then another open season. And in 3 of the 4 zones we take advantage of that structure most years. It's important to realize that's not an option for most other states. If they want to have 4 zones, they can't have that split segment arrangement. So if there is a state with 4 zones, they have to run their 60 days in each of those zones straight through with no splits. On the flip side, if they do want to have 2 segments with a split in the middle, the most zones they can have is 3. The other aspect of that grandfathered arrangement that we have is that if we ever choose to change that, we lose our current structure and we can't ever go back to it. So we've always had to be really careful with those parameters to make sure that if we ever do change, we need to make absolutely sure that it's a good idea, because we can't go back to our old structure. And I would also note that this year there was actually a request from the flyways to the Fish and Wildlife Service to allow other states to select that structure that Pennsylvania currently has, the 4 zones, 2 segments, but that was actually denied by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So there are at least some other states that are interested in potentially having the structure that we already do, but that don't have that option. One thing that comes up, if you look at least in recent years, the duck season structure in our north and south zones has been overall pretty similar. It's about basically a week different between the 2, and that covers the bulk of the state. And I think in those conditions, it's easy to say, well, why don't you just make a combination somehow of those zones, since the seasons aren't that different anyway. The big thing to think about there is everybody's gotten pretty used to 60-day duck seasons. It's been 25 plus years that we've had those, but there's no guarantee it's going to stay that long forever. So if we ever have to drop back to a 45-day or a 30-day season based on the status of duck populations in the Atlantic Flyway, I think that's when that ability to fine-tune geographically a little bit more and separate some of those dates, that option that we have with our current 4-zone 2-segment arrangement would get a lot more important than it might seem to be right now. All that being said, really Amanda should get the credit for doing all the work on this, but did a little bit deeper dive into the structure of our duck zones this year, just to look at some weather parameters, some waterfowl migration data, and see how our current seasons overlay with that. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Amanda to talk a little bit about that analysis.
Yeah, so I put together 4 graphs that we could all look at. I think it's important to understand how different all of our 4 zones are between temperature data, weekly bird abundance, and hunter preferences. So you guys should be seeing a graph come up. It's up there. Okay. So first we're going to talk about the Lake Erie duck zone. So what are we looking at here? On the left axis we have abundance estimate, and then on the bottom we have our hunting season dates, which should be September 1st to January 31st. And the two lines you see there, dabbling ducks and diving duck abundance, I took data from our most harvested species in Pennsylvania. The dabblers were mallards, black ducks, wood ducks, and American green-winged teal, and then our divers were lesser scaup, buffleheads, and ruddy ducks. So I added those two groups together so you can, just for simplicity's sake, not having a million lines on the graph. So you can see their abundance and how it goes throughout the hunting season. Highlighted in green, that block is our proposed hunting dates for the 2025-26 season. And then there's also a vertical dotted line. So that's what I'm calling our icing date. I actually accessed NOAA weather stations, mostly at airports within all 4 zones that had complete data sets, and I took data from every single day, the high and low temperature for every day for the last 10 years within all of those 10 hunting seasons, and I got a mean trend line, mean high and mean low temperatures. So that line that's sitting there, the dotted line, is where our mean low temperature over 10 years hit 32 degrees and did not go back up. So that's what I'm calling our icing date. I also should mention that the abundance data is also averaged for the same time period, which was 2014 to 2025, so our 10-year hunting season. So let's talk about Lake Erie Duck Zone now. So there's no split. Obviously, diving duck abundance is really important for the Lake Erie zone, and we can see that our hunting season, our proposed hunting season, and our past seasons as well are falling exactly when we have peak abundance of diving ducks at this point. So we also have some opportunity, a lot of opportunity before that icing date and a little bit after as well. And you can see that on the tail end there of our hunting season, we still have some ducks around, but that big push of ducks has moved on. So I have the clicker here, I forgot about that, I can change it. Okay, so Northwest Duck Zone. Here we have a split, and this is where our, in 2023 was our latest one, we did a hunter survey. I believe we had over 16,000 surveys sent out, and then there was a qualifying first question, have you hunted waterfowl in the past 2 years, and that brought it down to a little over 800. So we had a little over 800 respondents to this questionnaire, and basically we gave options, like 3 options for each zone, which splits, which dates would you like to see. And I should say that all 4 of these, they follow the most preferred option very closely, plus or minus a few days, because the calendar days fall differently in 2023 than they do for this year. But we know the Northwest zone hunters really want at least some of the deer firearm season within the split, so they can go deer hunting and not sacrifice their opportunity to also go duck hunting. But we see that there's a lot of opportunity for an earlier season hunt when that diving duck abundance again is really high, and then we do have some after the icing date, small opportunity with lower duck abundance after the firearm deer season at the end of the season there. And then we have the North Zone, a little bit of opportunity there before ice is up for an early season hunt when there's a decent amount of dabbling duck abundance. But then you can see that when dabbling duck abundance is highest, after the icing date in the North Zone, that's where most of our hunting opportunity is. And then our South Zone, a little bit less, a week or so opportunity for an early season wood duck hunt. And then at the end there's even amounts of opportunity for pre-icing date, post-icing date, and you can see that our duck abundance for dabbling ducks is highest at that point. Yeah, so I think, like Ian said, it's hard to meet everyone's preferences Other states do want this complex structure that we have. If we got rid of it, we couldn't go back. And I think the visual from this graph, these series of graphs, shows that there is a lot of diversity and preferences in different parts of the state. It's a big state, so that's why we're planning on keeping our zones the same.
Yeah, that's always been a challenge because depending on where you hunt, what species you prefer to hunt, what other species you would like to hunt during the course of the hunting season, everybody's got their own preferences, and we recognize that we'll never be able to satisfy everybody, but that's why that survey data is important. I would say too, just the fact that we don't plan to make changes to our duck zones, we're not claiming that they're perfect. If we could go back in time, maybe 40 years, and have some of this data that we have now, the lines might have been drawn a little bit different. But again, given that fact that we have a grandfathered arrangement that we could never go back to if we change, we'd have to be absolutely sure that we were benefiting a large majority of our hunters with any changes that we might make. And all the analysis we've done, at least so far, seems to suggest that at best it would be evening out. We'd benefit some, but hurt just as many on the other side. Shifting gears a little bit to goose zones, that's not quite as strict of a process as it is for duck zones. It's not a every 5-year open season the way it is for duck zones. It can be proposed at any given time. You may remember, particularly if you're in the northwestern part of the state, that a few years ago we did away with the southern James Bay population zone around Pymatuning. That basically just didn't make sense biologically anymore, so that was merged into the overall resident population zone. Now there's still some area state level restrictions in the immediate area of Pymatuning to manage harvest on that local resident flock at Pymatuning, similar to the arrangement at Middle Creek if you're more familiar with that part of the state. But for the 2 zones that we have now, most of the state's covered by the resident population zone, the southeastern quadrant by the Atlantic population zone. Again, we recognize that even in the AP zone, the majority of the geese there are residents, but there's enough of the Atlantic population present that that's what drives the regulations. And those zone boundaries are based on parameters that are vetted through the flyaway process and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So our resident population zone can contain no more than 10% of the migrant goose band recoveries for the state. So if you plot all those out over the course of multiple decades, you really see that high concentration of Atlantic population band recoveries in southeastern Pennsylvania. And we've basically drawn that boundary as tight as we can. As mentioned previously, we don't want to restrict opportunity any more than we have to on resident geese. And some of this research that's going on now might give us the opportunity to revisit some of those boundaries. Maybe we can carve out a few additional areas, but that's the background behind the goose zones that we have.
So another question that's really pertinent to this year is how avian influenza affects waterfowl and hunters. So thus far, we don't have enough evidence to conclude that this HPAI, high-path avian influenza outbreak, will have a long-term population effect on waterfowl. I know that there are multiple agencies and universities that are diving into this using GPS data and data from poultry farms. So hopefully we should have some more insight on that soon, but this still is, in terms of conducting a study and getting peer-reviewed scientific research published, this is still a pretty new thing, even though it's been on the landscape since, I think, December 2021. Mm-hmm. So HPAI is naturally occurring in wild birds, and because of that, we really can't control it, but what we can do is have some safeguards in place that we can take to protect mostly our domestic birds, like chickens or turkeys, and any wild birds we might have in captivity. There's a low risk to the general health of the public, like human health, but regular sanitary practices will help reduce the risks to humans and any animals that might be under human care so they don't get sick. Hunters take precautions while handling and dressing birds. Just be sanitary. You can wear gloves, protective eyewear, and a mask. but practicing good hygiene and washing any gear that comes in contact with birds, especially if it has blood or feces on it, is a good idea. And don't handle any wildlife, especially birds, displaying signs of illness, such as circling or head tilting, or if they're having difficulty flying or walking. And this is all especially important if you're a hunter and you have bird flocks at home.
Yeah, a lot of those poultry species are really susceptible. We've had some mortality in waterfowl from avian influenza in Pennsylvania this year, which has gotten a lot of media attention, obviously, but that's pretty unusual. Usually waterfowl are asymptomatic carriers, but chickens and turkeys and pheasants, which is a big concern to me because one of the other hats I wear with the Game Commission is overseeing the pheasant propagation program. So our biosecurity on the pheasant farms is really strict because of that concern. So yeah, if you have domestic poultry at home, be really careful if you're don't be using the same gear that you use for waterfowl hunting and interacting with your backyard chickens, because there's quite a bit of risk there. Before we move on to the question and answer period, there is one more general topic that we want to cover, and that's just to reiterate the difference between regulation and statute. So there are a lot of aspects of waterfowl hunting regulations that are under the control of our Board of Game Commissioners. That's regulation, it's called Title 58. An example from a couple years ago, our Board of Commissioners legalized ice eaters, those devices that keep water open during cold weather to keep an open hole that waterfowl are still attracted to. And there are a lot of things like that, but there are some aspects of hunting regulations that are ultimately under statutory authority. That's Title 34, and so those changes can only be made by the Pennsylvania legislature. There's a couple of waterfowl-related topics that seem to come up every year. Why doesn't the Game Commission change this or that actually fall into that statutory category where any changes would need to be made by the legislature? One of those is in relation to unplugged shotguns for the late goose conservation order. Again, it's within statute, the limitation on magazine capacity for shotguns. So any changes to allow that unplugged authorization that is allowed by the Fish and Wildlife Service for that strictly limited opportunity of the conservation order, not for the rest of the season, but any changes would have to be approved by the legislature before the Game Commission could implement them. Another one is in relation to Sunday hunting in general and waterfowl hunting in particular. I won't go into as much detail as we have in some of these in the past, although feel free, if there's questions about Sunday hunting and specific to waterfowl, feel free to include those and we'll try to address them. But just a little more briefly, we do have those 3 Sundays that have been available for several years now, consecutive Sundays in November during archery deer, firearms bear, and firearms deer season, as well as primarily for those 2 earlier days in archery deer and firearms bear. Other species, small game in particular, that had open seasons during that time are also open. But we keep those closed to waterfowl because we have a compensatory days arrangement that because all Sundays are closed in Pennsylvania to migratory bird hunting, we get an extra number of days that can be added on to the end of the season, where if we open those 3 Sundays to any migratory bird hunting, we'd lose our compensatory days and then ultimately lose opportunity. So just generally speaking, if you're interested in more Sunday hunting opportunity in general, or particularly in Sunday hunting opportunity for waterfowl, again, unless and until the legislature gives the Game Commission the authority to make more of those changes, any concerns or questions you have about that really need to be directed to the legislature. So we do have transition time now to the questions and answers that are coming in on the screen, and so we'll try to go through and address some of those. The first question, when was the last time the survey area on the breeding grounds was expanded or revised? I'm assuming that's in relation to AP geese, and since Amanda and I just had a conversation about this earlier this morning and she told me some updates that I didn't know before, I'm going to ask her to take this question.
Yeah, so our AP population of Canada geese, they breed in northern Quebec, and we fly transect surveys via helicopter every year to get a breeding pair estimate those transects have been locked in for quite a while. I want to say late 80s.
Yeah, it's been, early 90s, I think, was when
Yeah.
they were put in place. There's been some minor adjustments since
Yeah,
then,
but we
the
actually,
overall survey has been about 30 years.
yeah, but as I mentioned before, we have this, the fieldwork portion of our AP Canada Goose GPS collar project that's wrapping up. We've put out the 500 collars, so we're starting to put this data together and just from an observational early standpoint, can kind of see that the geese that we're marking are going a little bit further north than the traditional survey area for that survey that we fly. So actually this year we're planning to do a few more northern exploratory transects to see how many birds are actually there, and those transects are based on transects that were flown also in an exploratory fashion. Maybe that was the late 80s,
I think
a year
probably,
that
yeah.
popped in my head. So we do have some reference, like, okay, were they here? How many were here in the late 80s, and where are they now? So that might lead to some changes, but that's my update on the breeding pair survey.
We did have another, COVID's kind of in the rearview mirror now, but in some ways that's still having some effects to reverberate, I think, for waterfowl management, because there were about at least 2 and maybe 3 years where that Atlantic population goose survey wasn't flown. So we're just kind of having to make, I'll call them guesstimates based on past population trends and what we knew about weather up in the northern Quebec, how production might be affected each year. So there was a few years of missing data there that would sure be nice to have, because we've seen these declines since then, but we kind of don't know what happened in the interim. That's obviously a tough place to get to. It's up in the Arctic. It's expensive to do work, and with agency budget cuts, and it's probably not going to get any easier. But we do, as always, we need to examine all our sources of data, and if there's a portion of that population that we're missing, we need to do the best we can to make sure that we're actually incorporating that in the surveys. Again, not wanting to be any more restricted than we absolutely have to be for the conservation of that population.
We're ready to move on to the next question? Okay, cool. So next question, in reference to the graphs, what do the numbers for abundance represent? So all of this data is coming from a citizen science project called eBird. We know that their data is really reliable. It's been used in comparison with recent mallard telemetry projects. I think it was in Tennessee that was just published. They coincide pretty closely with migration patterns of actual, like, fine scale movement data from marked birds. And there's been massive papers published basically confirming the legitimacy of the data and how it follows migration patterns at a large scale. But the specific abundance numbers, so it's based on area and the number of birds reported on average from these eBird reports day by day. So you'll see, if you remember from the graphs, that left axis, the scale changed. I think Lake Erie zone went up to 70, and then the South Duck zone goes up to 6. So basically it's based on area. The Lake Erie zone sees a massive amount of diving ducks fly in at a certain point, so that scale is a lot higher. And basically it's relative to the area and the number of ducks that were reported.
A couple of avian influenza questions coming in. The first one of those, do you think that high-path avian influenza will have any impact on migration patterns? Well, this is a little bit of a question we can both speculate on, so I'll give my speculation and then Amanda can probably correct me. My sense is, in terms of migration patterns specifically, probably not a lot of changes. Actually, if you sort of look at it in the opposite direction, a lot of the concerns about how avian influenza has spread and continues to spread is that migratory birds, waterfowl or other migratory birds, pick it up either on the breeding grounds and take it to the wintering grounds, or vice versa, and of course all the stops of migration in between. Again, as I mentioned, Not always, but most typically, waterfowl are carriers of avian influenza, but it's unusual for them to die from it the way they have in Pennsylvania and some other parts of the flyway this year. So certainly for those individual birds, if they are negatively affected by avian influenza or any other disease for that matter, that will probably affect the behavior, including migration for those individual birds. But for the species as a whole, I don't think that the avian influenza would have a real impact on those long-term migration patterns.
Yeah, I would agree. It would likely affect individual behavior, but it's not going to. I think it also depends on where they're picking it up, whether it's on the breeding grounds, wintering grounds, during migration. But I don't think we're going to see a big shift in a migration pattern for an entire species in the Atlantic flyway.
There again, that's the type of thing that we can certainly be wrong, and having those data streams, those surveys to be able to look at those things over time and evaluate is really important. Another avian influenza related question: explain how high-path avian influenza is not affecting bag limits for Atlantic population and resident population. Potentially some confusion there. I think, and again, Amanda can jump in here as well, but I think the key point there is that those hunting regulations are based on population estimates, population trends, productivity estimates, sort of set amounts of data that really don't have disease as an input into the process. So the point would basically be that if there is a disease effect at the population level, and for Canada geese, I don't really think that's been the case. Certainly, again, there's been some isolated cases where Canada geese have died from avian influenza, but not at a big enough scale that we think it has a population level impact. But if that ever did happen, and that applies to any source of mortality, whether it's hunting or disease or habitat change, eventually those effects will show up in the population estimates, and as they work through the process, either kick us to a higher or lower bag limit for different species.
Yeah, and also just to add, the way that the federal process and season setting process works is the AP survey was done last summer for setting the regulations that we're talking about right now for the 2025-26. So we're having this worse HPAI year right now, so maybe we could see some effects in regulations and season setting, but again, we would have to wait for this summer for that breeding survey to be done and then see how it affects the 2026-27. So there's a little bit of a time lag there too.
Right, yeah, that's a good point. Up until about 10 years ago, if you've been around long enough, you remember that we set our waterfowl seasons late in the summer, so they were actually based on the data from that current breeding season. So if we would be setting the 25-26 seasons, there would be still surveys coming up here in April, May, and June. We'd get that data. Flyaways would meet in August and kind of had a very tight timeline there, but flyaways would meet in July, I should say. I'm forgetting my past history, but have those discussions based on that current year's data and set that year's seasons. And for a variety of reasons, one of which is those populations just don't tend to change that much in a 1 or 2 year time frame. And just to make things a little bit simpler on the regulatory process and keep from bumping right up against where we're running through all these regulatory processes right before the hunting season starts in September 1st for doves and Canada geese, we shifted to that process that we use now, as Amanda referenced, where we're actually using last year's data to set the 25-26 seasons. The surveys that happen here in April, May, June of 2025 will be used to set the 2026-27 seasons at this time next year. So that's a great point. Looks like we're maybe just about out of questions coming in. Again, there are additional opportunities for input. We do have a waterfowl open house at Middle Creek Wildlife Management Area this Saturday, March 8th, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So we'll have both Amanda and I will be there, as well as some other Game Commission staff, to talk about hunting regulations, population estimates, habitat management at Middle Creek, enforcement issues. If you have questions about why is this particular regulation that way, we should be able to answer those. So if you're able to make it to Middle Creek on Saturday, we look forward to seeing you there. Remember that the proposed seasons document is available on the Game Commission website, and please take a look at that. Submit comments via the waterfowl comments at pa.com, pa.gov email. And I would say in that regard, be sure to comment. We recognize that we'll hear from people that look at the proposed seasons document and see something in it that they don't like, and we definitely want to hear those comments. At the same time, we also want to hear from people that if you like the seasons the way they're proposed, please say that too, because we want to get that balanced input as much as possible. The comment period goes through March 21st, so 2 weeks from tomorrow, and we'll take a look at all those comments, run through the rest of the process that Amanda spoke about with looking at public comments, getting internal comments, running items past our Board of Commissioners, and then having that season selection letter at some point in April, and probably a news release in late April, early May with the final season selections. But again, thank you for your time watching today or viewing afterwards if that's the case, and appreciate your interest in waterfowl hunting and conservation, and take every opportunity to get out there and enjoy that waterfowl resource.
Thank you.